Yeah, well, thank you all for coming. So tonight, the reason why this style event is happening is that since I've been in Scotland now since 1988, I think, yeah, I remember Lockerbie, that scene, I always remember that's happened when I first came to Edinburgh, is that people say to me, why did you come to Scotland, why did you come to Edinburgh? So there's many reasons I could give, but one of the reasons I could give now is that the reason why I came was to meet Ian, Ian Grimstone.
Well done, Ian.
Because the type of information, well, the type of knowledge that I'm sure Ian's going to talk about, I'd never have got if I'd stayed in Liverpool. So by coming to Edinburgh and meeting Ian, his history, I've learned so much about Scotland, Edinburgh, the world, spirituality, which I wouldn't have got. So today's event is we're going to try and share some of that knowledge with you that I've been lucky to have acquired through meeting Ian. So it's going to be a form of interview style, and then we'll open up to everyone so you have a chance to ask questions. So, welcome Ian.
Thank you very much.
The first question is, are you Scottish?
I'm Scottish. Yes, yes.
Can you give us a brief insight into the Bluebunnet?
Yeah, the Bluebunnet is, I wear this because it is a symbol at once of our unity and our diversity as a nation. We were never one people, we were never one ethnicity, we were never one bloodline or one tribe. We were always the people like yourself that come here and were drawn to this land and settled here. And we had people that spoke different dialects of Gaelic. We had people that spoke different dialects of Scots, we had French, we had English, we had all kinds of people. And we dressed differently, we spoke differently, and so that we could recognise each other at key moments, whether that was going to battle or going to church, we wore a blue bonnet. Now it didn't have to be the same kind of blue bonnet, it didn't necessarily have a nice touré like this on it, but we wore a blue bonnet, and that was a symbol of Scottishness. And so it didn't really matter where you came from, it was what you bought into.
Right. You'll know that several weeks ago I sort of became obsessed with the workings of the cytoplasm of the cell and the role of, I've recently bought a book called Pharma Economics. It's about the money the pharmaceutical industry make through the drugs. And I thought I was becoming a bit intense about it. But when you came into the cafe, to the breakfast club, the first thing you started to talk about was the fact that you're starting to wean yourself off these type of things.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Could you just describe?
Well, I don't quite know where this comes from, but I mean, at key moments in my life, I stopped smoking, and I knew intellectually smoking was bad for you, and I'd stopped smoking before, but one time I just thought, this is bad for me. And it was a different level of awareness. Then, that happened with alcohol. I woke up one morning drunk, and I thought, how do I get into these scrapes? So I stopped drinking alcohol. And then something similar happened. I've got terrible arthritis in my knees, although that's much better just now. And for years and years, I took tramadol and cocodamol, and I couldn't sleep. We wake up with it. And for some reason, I got the idea, it just came to me that these were not good for me, taking these things. And then most recently, without particularly referring to any published information, because this stuff is, you know that sugar's bad for you, but again, just like the smoking thing, I knew sugar was bad for me, but I suddenly realised this is really bad for me, and on a different level, coming from a different place, in each occasion, and so I've stopped doing processed sugar. I haven't cut it out completely, everything, but I've stopped doing processed sugar. I don't eat sweets anymore. I used to eat sweets all the time, comfort go-to thing.
Yeah, good.
So that's, and my arthritis is, funnily enough, not really very bad at all now.
Yeah. It's interesting that Ian was like a mirror, because I thought I was becoming too intense about the whole thing, but no, it was you that engaged the conversation.
Yeah. I find it amazing. What I find amazing is that is that kind of like, I think it's summed up best when I talk about smoking. You sort of go, oh, this is not good for me at all. There's a different level to it, and the same thing is up to sugar.
Yeah, so where I live in up by the Pleasance, during the pandemic, I used to go out and get my portion of put a fish, single fish or curry and chips, and sit near the statue of Robert Fergusson.
Yeah.
And then after the pandemic, I was observing the tourists coming up, and they had these strange looks on their face. Who the hell is this guy? You know.
Yeah.
And then the information below is written in the Scots language.
Yeah.
Isn't it?
Yeah.
And so then I discovered you were responsible for putting that statue there of Robert Fergusson.
Yeah, I was part of the team that did that, and I like to think that the idea is he's buried. Robert Fergusson, the Scots poet, is buried in the Canongate Kirkyard. The statue is outside the Canongate Kirk, and he's walking from his grave to the Scottish Poetry Library, which is diagonally across the road, and he's aligned to do that. And others may have suggested that too, but I definitely suggested that.
The writing on the floor, though, is I can't make it.
No, Aldriki Whale Alcatoon that Scotland kens beneath the moon. So Aldriki, Edinburgh, the best of any town. Aldriki Whale Alcatoon that Scotland kens, that Scotland knows beneath the moon. That it's the best Scottish town. That's what he's saying. Aldriki, it's from Aldriki, which was going to be his magnum opus. He died before he finished it, but it's still pretty good. He's looking at 24 hours in the city of Edinburgh. He lived. Robert Fergusson was about 1750 to 1774. He died at the age of 24. I don't understand myself how somebody that age could have written such great poetry, because he transformed Scotland. And as a soundbite, I could say he's transformed the world, because I've found out even more. Should I say something about the film yet? No. Okay. I'll not say anything about the film. Okay, say that. But he's transformed. He did. I would argue it's never down to one person and one thing, but he transformed Scotland, and by that he transformed the world, because at that time he was writing poetry. He was a young man when he was, say, 20. He was writing poetry in the style of an English poet called William Shenstone. And so later, Robert Burns wasn't that age yet, but Robert Burns was writing poetry in the style of William Shenstone. Who is William Shenstone? Who's heard of William Shenstone nowadays? Nobody. Nobody's heard of William Shenstone. But we've all heard of Robert Burns. And Fergusson discovered that his real voice, his muse, his inner voice, wasn't in English, wasn't in the style of William Shenstone, it was in Scots. And at that time, people in Edinburgh, in the burgeoning Enlightenment, people were taking elocution lessons to rid themselves of their Scotticisms. They were trying to speak English. You know, would you like more bread? Yeah, Reverend, there's more bread in the bread bin. They were trying to get rid themselves of their Scotticisms to sound more English. And Fergusson he turned that round, because he gave voice to that almost counter-revolutionary feeling that, no, we shouldn't be doing that. We should be talking in Scots. What are we doing all this English for? This isn't how we speak at all. Come on. And so he had that, and he wrote in Scots. And years later, Robert Burns was doing the same thing, writing in the style of William Shenstone and getting nowhere. And he found a pamphlet of Robert Fergusson's poetry at his friend in Dumfries's house. He was there, and what's this? And it was like the floodgates opening for Robert Burns. It was like he saw this poetry of a recent nature in Scots, and he thought, that's what I'm going to do, write in Scots. And so he did.
So I asked you, why do you feel that you speak in Scots, don't you? So for me, that's not an issue for me coming from Liverpool.
No.
Scots. So I asked you, why do you feel the need to speak Scots as a human being? What is the soul nature of that?
It's the voice in your head, Ken. It's what you think in, but you can't talk it nowadays, because nobody jollies the word you're speaking on about, Ken. Yeah. I speak it less and less, to be honest, because I don't meet people that I can trust to understand me. And there's a stigma about it as well. People immediately imagine that you're uneducated if you're speaking Scots. And this is not the case, but that's what people... So you're going to have to overcome that. And unless somebody's going to actually understand what you're saying, then it seems... I like to speak more Scots. This is an unconscious thing, you know. I used to speak much more Scots. My father had a rich braid Scots, but and I hear that in my head all the time. But you know, I feel that it's genuine. There's different things you say in Scots to that which you would say in English. I was trying to think of an example. Like someday, I'll give it. Someday, I live in Oxgangs, and I was somebody greeted me and said, "All right, old Jim." And you know, if you translate that into English, it's "All right, old one." Well, it doesn't mean it's a literal translation of "All right, old Jim," but it has nothing about it that's the same.
So what puzzled me, Robert Fergusson breaks a leg and then ends up in the bedroom.
Yeah.
So, and then you told me there's another interesting development to that. Robert, I said, why does he end up in the bedroom? He's just...
Because of the state of mental health at the time. Mental health was a taboo subject. People were scared of mental illness. They didn't know what to do about it. And the site of the Bedlam Theatre today at the bottom of Forest Road, that was the Bedlam, and that's where you got put if you couldn't be managed. And Robert Fergusson may have had several things going on. He may have had syphilis, but this is you can't diagnose people retrospectively at this degree now. But he may have had all sorts of problems, but after he fell down the stairs, he may have banged his head as well as breaking his leg, and he was unmanageable, and he was living at home with his mother, and his mother couldn't cope, and so he was sent to the Bedlam. And Andrew Duncan, who you may be aware of, is the man that founded the basis, the core of what became the Royal Edinburgh Hospital at Morningside for mental conditions and similar personality disorders and that kind of thing. He was a young doctor, and he was visiting the Bedlam as part of his studies, and he knew who Robert Fergusson was, and he saw this young, brilliant man lying in his own filth in a cell in the Bedlam, and it affected Andrew Duncan so greatly that Edinburgh had a reputation for medicine at the time, so he was at the right place. So he founded the Andrew Duncan Hospital and took the care of mental patients from one level to a whole new level of compassion, which had not been there before. And if that had been in place, perhaps Robert Fergusson would have recovered, which is amazing to think of, because he was only, as I said, he's only 24. I used to say, when I was trying to get funds for the statue in the Canongate, I was trying to get the Scottish press interested in Fergusson, and they weren't. And so you had to come up with sound bites. So my sound bite to get newspaper coverage, which I got, was that if Robert Burns was the Elvis Presley of Scottish literature, then Robert Fergusson was its James Dean. You know, it's a bit like, you know, James Dean was like the John the Baptist of 50s culture. He came first, then he burnt out, and then there was Elvis, and Elvis carried on. And I saw a parallel, because that's the way I think.
So today's an auspicious day in respect to, it's the reminiscence of the Battle of Preston Pans. And St Matthew's Day.
And St Matthew's Day. So I've got a film on YouTube about this. The Jacobites created, as much as they could, to give critical mass to their cause. They created what you might call a secular mythology. They co-opted everything that they could to add to their story, to make it seem the correct thing to support. And they had a lot of latent supporters who were, for very good reasons, too scared to come out for them, but they were trying to encourage this, and they used the things to hand, such as, I'm sure that they'd arrived on the 20th of September, but the battle falling on the 21st was a gift for them, because there is a painting of Don and Prince Charlie. It's not he didn't sit for it, it's made up after the event, but of him being a Knight Templar at Rosslyn Chapel. Jacobite Freemasonry. Freemasonry as an organised thing is quite new in 1745. The Scottish Grand Lodge was only formed in 1737. English Grand Lodge 1717. This is a new development in speculative Freemasonry, and it's a big deal in those days. And so to have your battle on the day of St. Matthew was a big deal because it's the autumn equinox. That's the ancient druidical reason for the day being important, but it's Christianized as the St. Matthew's Day. And Roslin Chapel, the correct name of Roslin Chapel isn't Roslin Chapel, although everybody should call it that. That's how we know it now. But the correct name of Roslin Chapel is the Collegiate Chapel of St. Matthew. And so this was a big deal in Freemasonry. And the other thing that they did was they used the prophecies of Thomas the Rhymer from 500 years before. Thomas the Rhymer was a sort of quasi-Nostradamus figure for Scottish folklore. And in the romance of Thomas the Rhymer, he had prophesied, "On Gladsmuir shall the battle be." And so they call it the Battle of Gladsmuir. It's interesting, it's like, sometimes people say, well, how are there two different names for the Battle of Prestonpans? Well, if you look at the American Civil War, the Confederates had different names for the battles to the Unionist forces. So just like that, the Jacobites have different names for some of the battles to the Hanoverians, and the Battle of Gladsmuir was the Battle of Prestonpans. And it's at neither, it's at neither is it at Gladsmuir nor is it at Prestonpans. It's maybe near Prestonpans, but there we are. So building their own secular mythology, co-opting these things to make their cause seem right. Because Bonnie Prince Charlie said that once they try and they will, when they try and fight against the Jacobites, they will be so troubled by their conscience that the battle will be over before a shot is fired. They believe in their cause.
So give you a slight break here, to set this next episode up, Isabella, who you know, invited me to the Society of Antiquities. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So the Sir Tom Devine, the eminent Scottish historian, is on stage with 4 PhD students, and it's about the relationship between the Highlands and Europe in the 18th, 19th century. Yeah. That sort of it's not the Enlightenment, it's the romantic relationship, if you like.
Yeah, it does. The Enlightenment segues into the romantic period.
Yeah. So I was very nervous, so I said to Tom Devine about the composer Beethoven's relationship with the Highlanders and that interaction. And to cut a long story short, I was very nervous, and he took a long pause and said, I couldn't have put it better myself, So he picked up on what I was trying to say. That so these PhD students, so we talked about this, the romantic approach to understanding history and music and the arts through an inner journey rather than academia. Yeah. If you could, so that's something we shared. We believe that you could come to it through your own journey in life rather than learning through other means, if you like academia. Yeah. So this contrast between. Yes, because when he said I couldn't put it better myself, I was really pleased, to say the least. Yeah. But I have no background in academia. So.
Well, I mean, I think there's my last talk here was about the fact that sovereignty in Scotland is spiritual rather than political. This is a kind of similar thing. It's a thing that people feel, and one of the things about Jacobitism that's not discussed just now, Jacobitism, I would argue, is one of the main tracts that takes us through the Enlightenment into the Romantic period, because the Enlightenment was going on at the time of the Jacobite rebellions, which makes the Jacobite rebellions seem like a reactionary retrograde step, and that's how it's often presented now. And the second talk that I gave to the TS was about why that's not correct, because there were poets working in the Enlightenment, like Alexander MacDonald, who wrote the Beirlin of Clanranald, which is, at the time, a very modern Enlightenment Gaelic poem. It's written in the style of the classic Gaelic bard, Bardach, the classic Gaelic bardery, but it is dealing with subjects with an Enlightenment point of view. And he did that because of what you're saying. He did that so that people would access it emotionally, and it would be brought to the subject of the Enlightenment, not through an academic, intellectualized premise, but through the emotion of his poetry. And this is also what Robert Burns did. Robert Burns is, the best example from Robert Burns is My Love is Like a Red, Red Rose. And it has till all the seas gang dry, my dear, and the rocks melt with the sun. Now, we nowadays think that's just a nice romantic idea, but he's reflecting the Enlightenment ideas started by another Edinburgh man, James Hutton, about questioning the age of the earth and what they had discovered about geology. The rocks melt with the sun. Well, this is the new geology of James Hutton, who was the first man to seriously dispute that the world was 6,000 years old. And James Hutton, gave us the phrase that what we are witnessing through looking at geology are processes that are without semblance of a beginning nor prospect of an end. And so Robert Burns is co-opting that kind of wisdom into what seems like a romantic poem. My love is like a red, red rose. And this is more than a geology lecture. This is how people got it.
Right. So what we're going to see now is a film that Ian put together, and I won't bore you too much with how it came about, but I've talked about this before. So I said to Ian in conversation that Beethoven had encrypted the code into the second movement of his 7th Symphony, the apotheosis of the dance elevated to the divine. So I'm the only person, I go to bed at night thinking I'm the only person on the planet that has broke the code to the symphony, you see. So I was suggesting that this code had a relationship with the Brahman Indian, and the opening of the final movement is based on a Scottish or Celtic folk dance. Yeah. So there's Beethoven. He's connecting with India and he's connecting with Scotland. Yeah. So
yeah, which is what my third talk was, the connection between the Druids and the Brahmins.
We'll come back to that after the film.
Right, come back to that.
So I told Ian about the Edinburgh publisher George Thompson. Yeah. And you picked up on that, didn't you? And Rabbi Burns, the connection.
Yeah. And I had the basic. I understood the basic theme, but when I researched it to make this film, I found out that it was deeper and even more compelling. I thought maybe I was onto an idea that sort of hung together quite well. I didn't realise the specifics absolutely bear that out. And I since then found out even more. I found out one extra nugget.
Can you tell us?
Yes, I can tell you that. So that is that one of the key people that inspired George Thompson was Tenducci, the Italian. It was a castrato, actually. I was going to say tenor. He's usually called a tenor, but it was a castrato, which was supposed to be illegal. Countertenor, yeah. That's what they call it now. Yeah. That's the polite thing. It's a countertenor. Anyway, he had no balls. George Thompson was very much taken with him, and he had heard Tenducci singing Scottish airs. And this is what gave George Thompson the idea to start his life's work of getting first Haydn and then Beethoven to do Scottish work. But I found out that Robert Fergusson, who was dead by this time, Robert Fergusson was a personal friend of Tenducci, and he wrote the Scottish stuff for Tenducci. And that's not in my research when I made this film. But that is the case. So Robert Fergusson actually, not only did he praise the Romantic movement as a reaction to the Enlightenment in his own poetry, he did that through the music of George Thompson as well, indirectly. But it's indirect, but it's a direct line if you see what I mean. And what's even more interesting, this is speculative. George Thompson works as a legal copyist from 1774. 1774 is when Robert Fergusson died. He was a legal copyist. Did George Thompson get Robert Fergusson's job? Probably not, but if I was making the movie, that's what would happen.
Women, when they heard the countertenor voice by the man, they swooned and fainted with sexual ecstasy.
This was a bit pointless, really, wasn't it?
Well, he had a brother who could compete.
Oh, your brother.
But they thought that high vibration was
is that what they call it?
compared to like the deep voice today.
Yeah.
Anyway, so let's enjoy the film. Yeah, Ian put this film together, which I think is really good. But so it's just 7 minutes long.
As a Scotsman dedicated to the study and enjoyment of Scottish culture, it came as a complete shock to me that Beethoven had collaborated with two of our greatest writers, Robert Burns and Sir Walter Scott. How could this have happened? And how could it have happened without it being widely known? This I had to look into. Both premises, that it happened and that it is not widely known, are down to George Thomson, a fascinating figure who strove to usher Scots culture into all the refined music rooms of Europe. That his monumental work was largely in vain is as tragic as it is understandable. Nevertheless, the obscurity of these works by the towering figures of the international Romantic movement remains striking. Perhaps there is an ironic clue in the origin of this project. George Thomson was an Edinburgh civil servant in the late 18th century and early 19th century. He had a good income and a passion for music. As a member of the Edinburgh Musical Society, he played violin and sang in the choir, as well as eagerly attending concerts at St. Cecilia's Hall in the heart of the city. When he heard visiting Italian castrato Giusto Ferdinando Tenducci interpret Scots folk songs with passion and fashionable taste, his head was turned. He began to collect and publish Scots and Gaelic, the two ancient indigenous languages of Scotland, Scots and Gaelic songs for a new era. His intention was, no doubt, to both preserve and promote the music of Scotland. However, in doing so, his tasteful adjustments may have eviscerated the vitality of his subject. Could this be the guarantor of its eventual obscurity? Beethoven provided nearly 200 arrangements over the years for Thomson. Many were listed as WOO. However, the best known of Beethoven's collaborations was 25 Scottish songs. This was published in 1818 and includes song texts by, among others, Robert Burns and Sir Walter Scott. This work has the formal recognition of being Beethoven's Opus 108. Burns was by then deceased, but Sir Walter was cresting the height of his powers and renown as one of the world's greatest writers. He was a key figure and a talisman of the Romantic movement. And so was Beethoven. At the beginning of Thomson's project, Burns had nearly always refused payment for his work, and it is unclear how much, if anything, Scott was paid. But Beethoven was definitely in it for the money, getting 3 to 4 Viennese ducats per song setting. George Thomson was a self-appointed guardian and promoter of Scottish, as well as Welsh and Irish, folk culture, and he was both the impetus and the link in all of this. Without him, none of this would have happened. Also, as patron, it was Thomson's own pocket that underwrote the costs of his beautifully produced and expensive musical publications. He himself paid Beethoven those considerable sums of money, today around $500 per song. These sums were transferred through the Viennese offices of the bank Fries and Company. For much of their relationship, folios of music and text had to be passed back and forth through a Europe torn by Napoleonic War. They were smuggled through diplomatic channels. More than one copy was necessary to make sure that something arrived eventually, at either end. Whatever else we can say, Thomson's contacts were astonishing. Over the years, he enlisted the services of very many of the key figures in Scottish letters and utilised some of the greatest European composers available. Haydn, Pleyel, Hummel and Weber were all contributors to his project. But Beethoven was his star. They corresponded, most often in French, for years. The relationship had started before the high fame of Beethoven, when Thomson had been using the services of Haydn. When Haydn became ill and was unable to help, he recommended an up-and-coming composer called Beethoven. So what went wrong? Thomson's ambitions to have all of polite society playing Scottish songs in the drawing rooms was a noble one. He enlisted the very best collaborators. On paper, they are ideal for the job. But there were problems. In refining what he saw as clumsy rural or humble works for genteel company, he was maybe too keen to smooth out what he saw as rough edges, trusting rather to the fashions of the day. Even if that had been entirely appropriate, it would appear that those matters and manners of taste were not the stuff that endures, not as the original material had been. The guts and life force had been, perhaps, denuded. Beethoven's arrangements for piano, voice and optional strings, violin and cello, were both technically challenging and intellectually advanced for a drawing room audience of folk song. Thomson asked Beethoven to make the piano parts easier. This usually infuriated Beethoven, although he must have had some understanding of the market when he wrote in response to one such request that this was a less pleasant work for an artist, but surely good work for business. Thomson's obsession with the genteel probably consigned his project of nearly half a century of toil and payments to the dust of the musical archive. John Purser, in his seminal work Scotland's Music, has this to say: "In the late Georgianwood drawing room, talk of the soil was welcome, but the smell of it was not." Burns wrecked the words of Dainty Davy with successive revisions, cleaning it up for George Thomson's publications with their mostly unhappy arrangements of Scottish songs by Beethoven, Haydn, Pleyel, Kozeluth and Weber. These were the greatest composers of the day, but Scottish music largely defeated them. At the time, Sir Walter Scott felt pity for Thomson, and said of him, "Last night George Thomson came to see how I was, poor fellow. He has talent, is well informed, has an excellent heart, but there is great eccentricity about him. I wish to God I saw him provided in a country kirk. That, with a rational wife, would, I think, bring him to a steady temper. At present he is between the tining and the winning. If I could get him set to any hard study, he would do something clever." Thomson aspired to be the greatest of all the Scottish musical collectors and publishers. That he failed in this is a tragedy of his Herculean efforts. He was undoubtedly a figure in his day. His Raeburn portrait, that mark of a rival in Georgian Scotland, shows what we might expect: a slightly nervous and fussy man. He had played his part with the greatest figures of the Romantic movement, but he had never really understood that, however passionate an inspiration to him, castrati are no model for romance.
So in the past you talked about the relationship with the Druids and the Brahmins and the relationship with the Scottish land and the spirituality surrounding that. So could you, especially the rivers, the Tay?
Yeah, well that's actually pre-Druidic, but it's very interesting because the names survive. In topography, it's usual that river names are the oldest names, and they preserve ideas of the earliest cultures that later cultures can sometimes run with and go with. And that does seem to have happened with both the Druids and the Brahmins. If you imagine Europe in Neolithic times, perhaps, you have a great forest. We're familiar with, certainly in Scotland, they talk about the ancient Caledonian forest, the Great Forest of Caledon, and this spread all over Europe. And European folk tales, full of things like Hansel and Gretel and Sleeping Beauty, and things going on in the woods. And we have our earliest, deepest, almost hypnagogic folk tales are about being lost in the forest, the darkness of the forest. The way through the forest was to use the rivers. And rivers navigable by boat were the pathway. And I even have a crackpot theory, perhaps, because it's usual to construct a basis of thought that's called Indo-European. Indo-European languages and so on. And they seem to go back to a pre-Celtic point. Now, do the Druids come from that? Perhaps. They venerate rivers. You have the Ganges in India. You have the goddess rivers in Scotland and in England. The goddess was called Tea, and the rivers that are the Tea rivers are easy to spot. The Thames, Tyne, Tees, Tay, Teviot, Teeth. These D even, although it's a D, it's the same thing. D. There are lots of these rivers. Their names are duplicated. There's more than one D. There's more than one T. There's T's. Things like that. They are the Tay rivers. Tay rivers always flow east, and they are always navigable by boat. And they were the pathway through the forest. Now, my crackpot idea is that this is such an early idea that it actually is also reflected in the Tao. The Chinese, the Tao Te Ching, the Tao. Because the Tao is not obsessed, but the Tao frequently mentions the sacred feminine, it frequently mentions the power of water, and it is the way. And it's the way without you necessarily following any doctrine, it's just the way. And that's what you find in practical terms with a river that's flowing east, navigable by boat. And so the Druids, I think, I don't know if they didn't originate that, but they may have originated with the culture that had that and developed in Celtic times. But the landscape, the rivers and the mountains and the way they are the manifestation of Scotland, and people's Scottish culture is a response to the land. All culture in all countries is a response to the land. But that's why I believe Scottish culture is important for people in Scotland, because it's an authentic response to the land.
Fascinating. Just moving on, I saw a thing on your Facebook site about Braveheart and Braveheart. Something. Could you make the distinction you were trying to make between?
Yes, but between Braveheart and William Wallace.
Yeah.
Well, I have a couple of beefs with Braveheart, and the first one is that Braveheart wasn't William Wallace. The term Braveheart originates. It's mythic. This didn't really necessarily happen, but it's based on the story of Sir James Douglas, who goes into battle. To cut a long story short, he's on crusade. He's in Tiba, which is in Andalusia in Spain, and he is surprisingly surrounded by a Moorish army. He knows that his number is up. He's supposed to be taking a casket. Inside the casket is the heart, the embalmed heart of Robert the Bruce, his hero king. He's wearing it like a giant medallion around his neck on a chain. He's supposed to be taking it to the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem. He now realises he's not going to get there. So the legend, which almost certainly didn't actually happen, but nevertheless it's a well-told legend that's been told for many hundreds of years before they made the movie Braveheart, is that Sir James Douglas takes the casket in the chain round his neck, and he puts it on his sword, and he swings it round and round and round, and he flings it high into the air. And as it pirouettes through the air, he spurs his horse and shouts, "Lead on, brave heart, as ever wast thy will." And with that, he follows the heart of his hero king, charging to his death. So that's why Braveheart, to call him the wrong person, is a perfectly good story that is perfectly cinematic and legendary, and to go and muck that up and make it the wrong guy, that irritates me. That gives me my spectrum issues. And
you mentioned in conversation about Scotland being noted for its literal rather than its music, and you gave an interesting insight into that. Yeah,
the one of the reasons for that, I think, is when people lose some. They say that when people, maybe not true, but when they lose their sight, they become better at hearing or something like that. Energy gets rechanneled into the places that it can go. And we were a perfectly musical country, very much so, and theatrical all through the late Middle Ages, probably before that, but the evidence is from the late Middle Ages and through the Renaissance, the court of James IV and the court perhaps of James V of Scotland. In the 16th century were very colourful and musical places with all sorts of arts entertainment going on. And then in 1560, we have the Scottish Reformation. We become a Protestant country. And the version of Protestantism that was brought in by John Knox, who was headhunted by the Scottish aristocracy to be the figurehead of this Reformation, he was a Calvinist. And in Calvinism, John Calvin's doctrine was very much against music and artistic endeavour, like even painting, but dancing, things like that. And so it didn't stop. We didn't stop doing those things, but they were frowned upon. However, reading and literacy was very much part of what was approved. In fact, it wasn't just approved, it was promoted, and it was made mandatory. Behind it was a religious bigotry in a way. We'd see it that way now, perhaps. At the time it was just their new enthusiastic doctrine, how they were going to save souls. They believed that we didn't need priests. The only reason people needed a priest, the very emblem of Catholicism, was because they couldn't read. And the priest would read the Bible to them, and the priest would be the interpreter between themselves and God. And particularly Calvinism was a kind of Protestantism that rejected that entirely, and you were your own agent before God. Now, if you were going to be your own agent before God, you needed to be able to read. It's because you needed to be able to read the Bible yourself. And so in the new, slightly zealous, certainly fervent Protestantism, distractions like music and painting and plays and things like that were frowned upon. They still went on. People still did them. We were still a musical country, but you had to make it low key. You couldn't make it the focus of your life in the same way you could have done before, but you could make the focus of your life literacy. And on a Sunday, when you were supposed to be Sabbatarian, you were allowed to read, and so people did. And so you had the strange thing where Scotland would have the population about the 10th of England, and as printing, because funnily enough, you can make a case this would be a different talk, but Protestantism comes out of printing. It wouldn't have been possible without that, because you couldn't have got the Bibles to read. Anyway, but that's a slightly different point. But the literate population of Scotland shot up because one of the things about Protestantism, Presbyterianism, was that they set up parish schools. Now, there was supposed to be a school in every parish in Scotland. That didn't quite happen. But it happened on a significantly large scale, so that Scotland became significantly more literate per capita than anywhere else in Europe. They did it with religious fanaticism, and although we had only the 10th of the population of England, we had the same reading population. And so that's how Edinburgh, which until quite recently was famous for publishing, could do this, because the market for a book published in Scotland was the same in terms of sales as in England. And so we became very much a literate population.
Isabella's not here tonight. She's a blue badge guide, a tourist guide. When I listened to Ian's take on how he was a tourist guide, still is, I'm engrossed in the way you tell the stories.
Sorry.
Yeah, so thankfully Isabella's not here.
Go to hell.
Isabella's not here tonight because
Music.
So could you just describe how you see the blue badge guys and how you come across them?
Well, I have the blue badge guide approach is not what most of us do, even the ones with blue badges that are good at. I have a story about a colleague, my colleague Ian Lynn, who at great expense became a blue badge guide. And Ian Lynn's tour style, everybody should do their own style, I believe. The blue badge guide thing somehow seems to cookie cut people into a mould. And they told Ian Lynn to stop telling his jokes. And I thought, Ian Lynn at that time had been a successful tour guide for many years before he sought the extra authentication of the blue badge. And when I heard that, I thought, that's the jokes are very often I've got a kind of, the jokes are very often the strongest part of any tour guide's gig. You know, I don't know. And to be told not to tell your jokes, I think there's a misunderstanding where when you're guiding tourists, they're not studying for a Scottish higher in history. You know, that's not what's going on. You've got to. It's a different approach, I think, is required. But there are many, many good Bluebunnet guides. I don't want to say, but I didn't feel compelled to go and spend my money doing Bluebunnet.
So, just moving on before we open it up to questions, thank God Christine's not here because she likes the guy Andre Roux. Do you know Andre Roux? Yeah. So, as a Theosophical History event, at the end they played this compilation, and when Andre Roux came up, I'm looking for the exit doors. So I got myself a sort of slagged off by the group because they all came at me saying, "What's this about Andre Roux?" And I couldn't really explain to them. I thought it was appalling that this was on. But when they show the street girls singing, it's all very nice. I think it's just like it's not art. So when I met Ian, you described it in more graphic detail than you. But if you could just share with them because you basically summed it up really well.
Well, it's an intellectual and artistic abyss. It's the inversion of all art. And I'm sorry, I wish I could remember what I actually said, but I'm not a fan of Andre Roux. It's
something we share, yeah. Because I think it's contrived. It's not really art. It's not.
No,
but some people think it has a place, but I'm literally looking for the exit doors.
People love it, so you have to be careful. But it is it's excrement made oral.
I agree. Well, just starting to sum up now. So everything you said about Scotland, the land, spirituality, how does that relate to you wishing that Scotland could become an independent country?
Yes.
Yeah, how does that fit?
Well, I believe that Scotland doesn't get to set its own agenda, and that is the most important thing. You could come out with a list and a litany of individual grievances, but to me, and they would be justified and blah, 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 but to me, it's, as I said earlier, I believe that culture is a response to the land. We are not getting that from our politics. Our response to the land is not articulated by the constraints that Westminster puts upon us. There's a test case just now about the gender recognition. It's not a particular subject of mine, but you know, I believe everybody should be free, and I don't see why Westminster needs to veto that or anything else. There are certain endeavours that we would do in Scotland. Topically, there would be green energy. We were researching tidal power, for instance. We were having great research at the front of that, and the funding for that was cut now by David Cameron at the time, and we've lost all that ground. I don't believe, that's just an example, but I don't believe that would have come from our culture to stop researching tidal power. And there are hundreds of these, but that's the basic overarching point, is that our culture is a response to our agenda, and we should be the ones that determine how we nurture our own assets, and these constraints shouldn't be set out with Scotland. That's how I see it.
So to finish, you asked me why did I come to Edinburgh, or Sat and Brian did. So I said I was following the Jungian path, because Jung's most profound dream in his autobiography, Memories, Dreams, Reflections, is where he comes to Liverpool in 1928 with some friends, and the place where he describes, where he visits, is exactly the place where the Beatles started off. So I suggest that Jung is preempting this cultural, global phenomena, the Beatles. I have no doubt, because so as a consequence, there's a statue of the Beatles outside. There's a statue of Carl Jung outside where the Beatles kicked off the Cavern.
Really?
Yeah, there's a statue of Carl Jung. So the other week in the Edinburgh Evening News, they're now going to put a statue of John Lennon next to Murrayfield Stadium, where he used to come and visit his auntie. So there's a sort of there's me following that Liverpool to Edinburgh type.
Yeah.
And you said to me something really significant about Lennon in the way that he could create. Do you remember what you said? How he was able to, the next word or the next note just followed.
He famously said that you just say what you mean, and you put it to a back. You say what you mean, you make it rhyme, and you put it to a backbeat.
Yeah.
And that's it. And
it just came.
It worked for him, but he was like Robert Burns in the way that he had an unerring ability to write something simple, and just it can't really be improved upon. And he's not showy, and he's not trying to play to the gallery. He's writing something that could have been just written for himself, but I think it's the sincerity and the honesty that underlines it that makes it work and makes it appeal. And people that didn't even know they were into it. I mean, like across the universe, what's that about? But everybody gets it. They don't know quite why they get it, but they get it. Mm-hmm. Words are falling out like endless rain into a paper.
That's what Elvis was into. We had a copy of Malevsky's Secret Doctrine. Elvis Presley.
Elvis, yeah.
He's a big hero of yours.
Yeah. Elvis is. The thing I liked, I've slagged off Braveheart, but the thing I liked about the Elvis movie, there was things I liked about the recent, I don't know if anyone's seen it, but the thing that I liked about the Elvis movie, not everything I liked about it, but the thing I liked was it made it utterly clear that what he did when he mixed black music, black from the southern states music with country music, he was not doing cultural appropriation. He grew up in a place in Tupelo, Mississippi, called Shake Rag, and he grew up in the black area of town, and he grew up with that. And he also, this is not in the movie, I don't think, but he attended a black church, and he was in the choir at a black church, and he was the only white person in the congregation. And so there are all sorts of things that he was genuinely, like John Lennon, in a sense, he was genuinely unafraid to express what he actually felt. And that's why his music works, because in every style of music that he sings, it sounds like he's singing it for you. He sounds like he's singing something sincere, even though he didn't write the music. Unlike Lennon, he didn't write the music, but he makes songs his own, and he changed the world. Both of them changed the world in different times. Some people do.
Yeah. To sum up, so back in Liverpool, I used to live in a B&B with the homeless who came out of a hostel. So I had this little transistor, the old transistor, with Beethoven's Ninth stuck to my ear like this. And so in May to that, I'll go to Vienna, where there's going to be the 200th anniversary of Beethoven's Ninth Symphony. So it's a major event. So I've gone from living with the homeless with that stuck to my ear to this huge, in Vienna. So the reason I'm saying this is Ian has put the pieces in the jigsaw for me, which I'd never have got, as I said at the start, if I hadn't have come to Edinburgh. So good, thanks Ian. So
well, I'm delighted that you came to Edinburgh.
Thank you. So now that was great, Ian. That was great. So now we're going to open it up to questions. So
and do things directly. So talking language, that's all about it.
Good stuff.
Ian's written a novel called Brick. Bricks. Do you want to give a quick insight? It's on the Amazon.
It's on Amazon. Yeah, it's $2.99.
Bricks.
Yeah. Well, it's based on. I wrote that a while ago. It was, funnily enough, when I started writing it, I hadn't stopped drinking, but the character, the central character in it isn't me, but it had occurred to me that. We go on about drugs, and drugs are whatever they are. For some people they're good, for some people they're utter disaster that ruins their life. But the thing that gets missed, I think, in society is because it's so acceptable as drinking, and the levels of people drinking in Edinburgh can be huge, and it can affect your life. And there are lots of men. I think I started writing this in the noughties. And it was the fact that society misses that there were lots of men in that era, particularly still perhaps, not coping, because traditional values have abandoned the traditional markers of masculinity, probably rightly, but for a lot of men nothing has replaced that. And so the father figures that were the role models have been discredited. You know, the strong breadwinner, gruff, prone to violence, lots of drinking, but nevertheless the pillar of the domestic situation. That was a cliche and a sort of archetypal figure that had served particularly working class culture, but not just working class culture, for a long time. And that role has been discredited. Women have equal rights. There's nothing. My point wasn't that that was wrong. My point was simply that, and taking away this role model and not replacing it, you have left a lot of young men with nothing. And if they had enough spark about them and enough luck and breaks, they could step past that without breaking stride. But for some men, they went into a spiral of abandonment and they weren't even mourned. And so I had two characters in my novel who were I wouldn't call them this, but society would have called them losers. But it's not a nice way to talk about anybody. But and my premise was that they ended up meeting each other and almost by osmosis, mentoring each other. Because between the two of them, they had the makings of one good man. That was my cliche. But in fact, they saved each other just by being there. One of them was lacking one lot of qualities, another was lacking another lot. But they complemented each other, and they did it just through a kind of almost unplanned brotherhood that and that's what men need. You know, you need to have a band of brothers. Whether you're successful or whether you're failing, you need to have a band of brothers. And that shouldn't be looked down upon by society. And it was. I don't know if it's as bad now, but there was a time where young men had just been abandoned, and that you were just bad, and masculinity is toxic, and that's it. And you're just toxic, and that's it, cheerio. And that's that. So my novel was an addressing of that.
Yeah, interesting. Is it doing quite well?
It did well for a while.
Yeah.
I wouldn't say it's sitting in Heather Power now, but perhaps after tonight when you all go and buy it. There's a lot of swearing in it.
Actually, Ian, I'm just interested, you used the word there, toxic.
Aye.
I'm very sorry, I haven't read your novel yet, but did you use that word in that language back then? Because
No.
that's a bit of a buzzword.
Yeah.
Now.
No, I don't think I did. No, I think I picked that up and using it sort of retrospectively. I did. It was. But I saw this happening, and it didn't happen to me. But I could. What I saw was it could easily have happened to me, and so I just imagined what it would be like if you were in that kind of spiral. It opens up in the high flats that have now gone at Oxgangs. I live at Oxgangs. I haven't always lived there, but there was the high flats, Alamere Court and Kirketton Court, looking at the Penthans, the hills of those names. And they used to put the men that had absolutely, in those days, before the housing associations really took over, and it was Kunselhuses, the guys with no points, no social standing whatsoever, would get an unfurnished room, probably with nobody in any floors around about them, and windows in everywhere, and that's where they would go. And so Bobby the guy says, he's explaining that, he's going back to, it's in first person, so he's coming back from the pub one night after disgracing himself in an alcoholic stupor, and he says, I'm not one of the furniture people, because there's no furniture in his flat. It's just a mattress on the floor. I'm not one of the furniture. He doesn't really think there's anything to that. That's how far he's fallen. It's just furniture. Great view. Aye. Let her swirl on a boot and that.
I just think that I'm sure I could ask you dozens of things, but you can't remember them all. The funny thing, what entered my head was, you speak far more clear English than the Londoners, or anybody in the south, because they don't produce R's and T's when they're talking.
No.
Especially, well, most of them, but especially towards the Cockney.
No.
They just don't bother.
That's right. Well, I think
Getting on.
the Cockneys aren't the worst bit for me. The one, because you can attune your ear to Cockney. You sort of, after a while, you sort of get what they're trying to say, and you sort of can predict it, and it's all right, really. You can sort of understand it. But the one that gets me is what you might call estuary English, which is just something just south of RP, but and they've stopped using vowels and consonants, and it's my theory. I was thinking about this one day, is that when a language has been spoken for a long, long time within a sort of group that understands it well, it can do by inflection. It's like, I imagine Mandarin Chinese. I don't really know enough about Mandarin Chinese to make this point, but I'm going to make it anyway. One of the difficulties of Mandarin Chinese apparently is the tones. So there are words that are ostensibly the same, but the tones differentiate them. And I think that estuary English that you can now get on the television, all the television presenters seem to speak it. I can't understand it. I'll give you an example. If I said to you, I like this book because, okay? I like this book because. The estuary English says, I like this bit because. One vowel. I like this bit because. No. I like this book because. I like this bit because.
Well, in the time we have, one thing I asked you was about Henry and William Cecil, the Cecils. And they had to act quickly to make sure Jamie
got the crooning. Aye.
And you told me about what was going on there with James the First, James the Sixth.
James the Sixth, yeah.
Could you talk about that? Could you have an interesting take on?
Yeah, well, I mean, the way it's presented now is that James VI, Elizabeth dies and James VI gets the crown, as if, of course. But that look at English history. That they change their monarchs at will. The Plantagenets, the Tudors, the people get murdered in towers. There's all sorts of things go on. It doesn't follow because you have a good claim on the throne that you get it. Look what happened to James's grandson. He got kicked out. James is a very interesting character. I don't like everything about him at all, because he's the man that gave us the Union. But you look at this man and you think, my God, just like Cecil on the English side, Cecil the father and the son. I mean, these people were serious operators, working with psychology. James probably understood the situation better than Cecil, because the Cecils were very, very clever. But James knew they were very clever, and he knew what he was doing, and he inveigled himself into their plans and let them think that he was their pawn. But of course, nothing did he want more than the crown of England. And I always think, if you were making the movie, you'd have James VI, now James I of England, on the barge. This is the thing that did happen. The way I would film it, he processes down the Thames on the royal barge, and he's like, if I was directing the movie, he'd be like that. New hat. He'd be thinking about all those other Jameses, all those other James Stewarts that died in battle against the English, that were marginalised by the English. The one to come that would be, he wouldn't know that. But there's him, a little diminutive, dribbling man. He had a problem with his mouth dribbled. He was an open homosexual, or bisexual anyway, but he was not your an alpha male all the time, and yet he'd outsmarted them all. Here he is with his new hat.
You get the King James Bible.
Yeah. Well, when he goes down there, this is. I think this is very interesting, because it shows you how clever he is. Protestantism is new. Protestantism is the reason that his predecessor Elizabeth got the throne. She comes out of a counter-reformation. So Henry VIII, her father, makes up English Protestantism, which is basically you swap the Pope for the King and you allow the priests to do it with ladies. And that's apart from that, it's pretty much the same. But Protestantism is a movement in Europe at the time. There's the Counter-Reformation with Bloody Mary, and then Elizabeth comes back in. So what Protestantism is not a fixed thing. We look at that and think it's assured. Now we look at it and say, oh, this is what happened and that's how it is. But it was in a state of flux. And when James arrives, he's a new king to them. Now, but he's not a new king. He's been a king in Scotland for 36 years. And so he comes down to England, and they all think he's going to be some kind of bumpkin yokel. And they're trying, all these different factions of Protestantism are trying to get his favour, and they're trying to get him to endorse their particular brand of Protestantism and how they want it to be. And he just goes, right, now to sort this out. What we need now is a good new translation of the Bible into English, because the one we're using is not very good. And, and so he sets them all off into committee work for years and years and years as they go and debate how they're going to do the new Bible, and that's them sorted out. And the thing about James is he knew his theology. He could read. He could read. He was fluent in Latin, as a lot of people were. Fluent in Latin, fluent in Greek, and he could read, although he could not speak Hebrew. And so he could look at what were in those days the original texts. We have better original texts of the Bible now, but the ones that were available then, and he could find the errors that had been passed down, errors in translation that had been passed down. So he knew that, and he also was a patron of the arts. And you look at Shakespeare, a big thing at the time, and Shakespeare wrote Macbeth for him. He's right in there. So he knows that the voice of God has to at least be as good as Shakespeare. So we don't know if Shakespeare or Roger Bacon or whoever it might have been who was involved in writing. But what happened was he set up a system for the Bible that his friends, particularly at Cambridge, but Oxford as well, he had more friends at Cambridge, but he had them work on the actual translations. But before they were committed to be in the Bible, he had the poets of the day take what the academics came up with and make it poetic. And they would look at the work, and the thing they would say if they didn't like what the academics had come up with, oh, that's an unfortunate phrase. So they would correct the unfortunate phrases. And that's how you come up with these poetic ideas like the prodigal son and things like that. These are all these kind of ideas, and the talents, and the way that these things are presented are because of the academic and the poetic inclinations of James VI, James I, who was marking their work as they went. And
one last brief question before we finish.
If the independence results have been different, so we're talking about 10 years ago now, where do you think the Scots language would be now?
Oh, that's a good question, because unfortunately, I've been a member, and still am, although with less unrestrained ardour than at one time. I still am a member of the SNP. I've been a member of the SNP since the 1980s. However, the SNP's record on Scottish culture is not great. And I think it's a major, major failing. So I don't know where the Scots language would be. I don't know how well that would have helped. I would like to think that it would have helped more. They've recently passed a motion in the Scots Parliament that they would do more for Scots if something happened. They should have been doing that all the time. They should be doing it now. The Scots language is, and Gaelic, I mean, Gaelic has, because Gaelic is more, doesn't have the same, Scots suffers from being thought of as lower class, and Gaelic doesn't quite have that burden. And I think that these attitudes are wrong. Scots and Gaelic are in different situations, but Gaelic has attracted more funding. Gaelic has been more ostensibly different as a language, whereas Scots is still seen as bad English, and that infuriates me because Scots is not bad English. Scots is not corrupt English. There's a kind of hierarchy thing that goes on, as if Scots is like inferior English, as if there's a hierarchy of language, and you're speaking a lower version of the proper language, and that's not what it is. Scots and English are related very much. They are derived from common roots, but they are derived from common roots. Scots is not derived from English. It's derived from the same places that English is derived from, but it's not derived from English. And it's been different for a long, long time. The vowel shift is the biggest tangible thing. Hoose instead of house. Get out my house. As opposed to get out of my house. Which doesn't have the same sort of imperative. Does it? I mean, it's not. Get out of my house. Get out of my house!
Could I just add something slightly connected? I'm at a theatre company, amateur, but very good in Edinburgh, and we once did Macbeth in Scots. I mean Scots, not like Glasgow, but
Stratford. You went to Stratford, didn't you?
Yeah, and but so there were words that we didn't understand, and I was in charge of keeping the accents right, so I had to look. So and the amazing thing, we presented it in Stratford because we were picked to go there out of other companies, and the amazing thing, well, certainly when we were doing it in Edinburgh, was although people couldn't, modern people wouldn't understand all the words, the audiences got it.
Aye.
They got it. Of course, you've got acting as well.
Yes. Yes, you've got
because
to.
Because although it was an act, you have to act, i.e., be the person and believe in yourself.
Yeah.
So that astonished me that it went so well.
It's good. It's underused. People are too tentative and frightened to use it. I mean, as I admitted myself at the beginning, I don't come out with it as much as I used to, and it's a self-consciousness because you think that people won't understand. I think that you might not be understood. But if you are performing, like you're saying, I noticed this. I used to be part of a group called the Merchants of Renown, who did Scots readings. Some performed a performed reading of a play. We had the script in front of us, but we were performing it as much as we could. We did The Gentle Shepherd by Alan Ramsay, was one which was a major thing for Scots at the time when people were trying to lose their Scottishness. But when you're reading poetry, you know when you're reading it well, because people are getting it even if they don't fully understand, because the Scots language does have a force to it that perhaps English does not, because there's a kind of alliterativeness, an alliteration and an onomatopoeia about it that suggests things, and it has a visceral power that I don't quite find in English.
You might find it in regional English.
Aye, maybe. Aye.
Yeah.
Aye.
I mean, a lot that's common.
Aye.
I mean, I think I was thinking similar thing that, like, Geordie in UK is akin to not.
Well, it's Scots.
It's more
There's
the same kind of syllable.
Geordies. I would, if I'm feeling brave and there are no Geordies in the room, I could make the point that Geordie is Scots, rather than English, and I would base that on the vowel shift as well, because they say like "get out my house," and they say "gannon" when we would say "ganging."
Yeah.
And they say bairn, although they can't say it properly, they say bairn. That's the word is bairn, but never mind. You can't hear all things all the time.
We better stop. Well, let's thank Abe for giving us an insight into his amazing knowledge world.
Thank you very much.
Thank you all for coming.
Thank you all for coming. So, you're very welcome, and it's always a privilege to be here.
You've been taking part.
Yes.
Thanks, Ian.
Great stuff.